The UK has its first female Chancellor, and today she had her first big moment. Rachel Reeves stood up in the House of Commons to accuse the Conservatives of a cover-up, a £22 billion black hole in the public finances that she says came as a complete surprise, leaving a financial mess that she will have to clean up.
If we cannot afford it, we cannot do it.
So much for all those election campaign promises. The man supposedly responsible was sitting opposite, looking pretty annoyed. The now Shadow Chancellor Jeremy Hunt accused her of playing politics.
That's why today's exercise is not economic, it's political.
Something he has presumably never done. I'm Liz Bates, and on today's Daily, was this all just a political performance designed to give the new government an excuse to make cuts and raise taxes? Or did they really open the books to find that there's no money left? Let's start by digging into the figures with our business correspondent, Paul Kelso. Thanks for joining us, Paul.
Pleasure.
So the first thing that I would like to ask you, it's always quite difficult immediately analysing big fiscal statements like this, big numbers thrown around. The main bit of what she was saying today was this £22 billion black hole that she framed as a sort of surprise. First of all, can you put that into context for us in terms of the public finances? How big of a figure is that?
Public finances, off the top of my head, receipts from taxes and what have you this year, 24-25, is forecast to be about 1.2 trillion. So out of that, 20 billion isn't a huge amount, but it's enough to run a significant government department. It's a lot of money. And I suppose the key question we had as we're sitting down, I've just been to a lock-in, as it's called, at the Treasury, wood panelled, etc. All our devices taken away and presented with this 30-page document. And the big question we had going in there was, is it fair for Rachel Reeves to describe this as a surprise? She
made out like she'd sort of gone in, first day at work, and opened some books.
So there are books that you open. So the argument against it is that everything's reviewed to death by the Office of Budget Responsibility. The OBR reviews everything. So all your multi-year stuff like budgets for the next few years, that is all audited and out there. What isn't is the in-year spending. And what Labour and what officials at the Treasury and what Rachel Reeves is saying is that what she did was look at the in-year spending. That's 2024-25. This year, day to day, the Treasury is managing what's coming in and how much we're having to spend. And that the in-year accounts, for which there is a book, were flashing red. And I think it is fair on a lot of these numbers to say that she's right to have been struck by some of them. The reserve for the year, that's the money the Treasury puts aside. It's under the Treasury's mattress.
It's emergency money.
It's emergency money for stuff that just happens, that's unexpected, which happens all the time. It's about £9 billion. That looks like it's being spent a few times over on costs that aren't budgeted for, like the additional spending in migration, £6.4 billion. Most of that's hotel bills. That is eating up 2/3 of the reserve. It's probably fair to say that that's unexpected and needs addressing. The cost of industrial action in the NHS, £1.5 billion. There's costs that she might not have known about.
So some of this money she probably wasn't expecting, but she's also leaning into it for political reasons.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I think that's exactly what's happened, and they've lent in pretty hard, I would say.
So she's identified this black hole. How's she going to fill it?
Because she's not going to fill all of it in this process, and I'll just very quickly run through what the black hole is, and I will make it quick. Pay over £11 billion, and that's in what's required this year and in future years, because she's accepted these 5.5% pay.
Yeah, so pay rises across the public sector.
Pay rises across the public sector, which were not budgeted. So this is money that isn't budgeted for. So for this year's 2% is budgeted for. So that 11 billion quid is on top, what it's going to cost on top of what was budgeted for. Pressures on the health service, pressures on migration, 6.5 billion, 6.4 billion pounds. That is a lot. 2.5 billion on rail, nearly 3 billion actually, that's a bit for Ukraine. You end up with nearly 22 billion once you take off various accounting measures. She's looking to take £5.5 billion off that this year, the biggest of which is an old favourite, departmental efficiencies. They're back, and this time they're bigger than ever. I'm not sure they're bigger than ever, but administration budget's going to be cut by 2%. All non-essential spending on communication will end, which makes me wonder what we will do as journalists if all non-essential communications cease. Well, I do wonder how long we'll get through a weekend.
It was consultation, right, and communications.
Yeah, exactly, and consultations the other bit. But these are the big ones. Winter fuel payments will now be means tested. That's a huge change to a lot of people. Huge change. It's £200 you get for winter fuel payments if you're of pensionable age and you're under 80 as a one-off payment, and you get £300 if you're over 80. 11.5 million people get that. Means testing it, which essentially means if you get pension credit, that's down to 1.5 million people. In a climate, literal and metaphorical, where energy bills are double what they were before the war in Ukraine. That's a lot of money. And there's another one in here, the end of social care reform, or the planned social care reform, caps essentially how much you spend on social care at £100,000. It also raises the floor. It's quite complex, but essentially means it's pooled social insurance to stop people being devastated by social care costs. Labour have said it was unfunded. It was going to cost £1 billion next year, nothing this year, but it was unfunded, undeliverable, so it's out. But I think those are just two really quite substantial measures which have gone with a stroke of a pen. I mean, there are fundamentally underlying this some really hard economic facts, which probably should stress, the public finances are in a really, really tough state. We've got a nearly £90 billion deficit in this year before we add in all these pressures. We have got costs coming down the line. We have massive pressure on our public services that is unsustainable not to address, and you've got an economy that is not growing, that is sclerotic, more people out of the workplace through sickness. I mean, I could go on and on and on.
Yeah, don't.
There are very real pressures.
It's too depressing, Paul. Give us
I
some
know.
hope.
There's not a huge amount of joy. It's a beautiful day out there. There are huge pressures that are real and aren't a question of political spin. The fundamentals aren't great. How you address them is always going to be laced with politics, particularly if you look at everywhere she looks in the Commons, she sees a friendly face.
So we've identified this black hole. She's set out some ways that it will be filled, but there's more that she has to do. So what is to, we've got the budget is coming October the 30th. What can we expect from that?
Yeah, there's £16.4 billion of what they're calling spending pressure left in the system that hasn't been addressed today. That will be dealt with through the much more formal process than what we got today of a spending review, which will begin, and a multi-year spending review will conclude next spring. But the budget in October will give us a one-year budget and also the first year of that spending review. My guess is you end up with something like a mix of more spending cuts. It's very hard to see a world in which there aren't tax rises. Remember, there's a very limited field for tax rises. She's ruled out 3/4 of the big tax raising measures. And then I think they'll look at the debt calculation and these fiscal rules that again, self-imposed about how much you can borrow. But I think a mixture of the three. But if there's ever going to be whopping great tax rises, it's in the first year after a whopping great election win.
Okay, so what you're saying is some quite scary things to come around Halloween.
Quite scary. We get sweets as well, so there'll be the usual.
So a few sweets, a few scary things, a few sweets.
But it is scary. The public finances are really grim, and somebody's got to pay for it. And that's what politicians are extremely reluctant to admit, and spent an entire election campaign on both sides not really wanting to address. But it's coming.
So on that slightly depressing note, let's take a break for a second. And when we come back, we'll ask why now has Labour chosen to talk about how bad the public finances really are. In Westminster, everything is political. So what was the strategy behind Rachel Reeves' statement, and will it work? To find out, let's speak to our deputy political editor, Sam Coates. So Sam, we knew this moment was coming, didn't we?
In many ways, we were predicting in the middle of the election campaign that we would get a moment exactly like this before the end of the year, and it's come less than a month into this administration's existence. But nevertheless, it's a key point politically because it tells you the kind of tone that the government are going to adopt over the next few years, and it's a key point economically because big decisions were taken together that will affect millions of people's lives, decisions that were not signalled in the Labour manifesto, yet less than a month in, they felt that they needed to take.
It was the tone, wasn't it? Because it seemed very different from the campaign. I mean, presumably because political campaigns have to be basically a big long list of promises to get people to vote for political parties. I mean, even the framing in the House of Commons, it just seemed so many grim faces. It was very serious. And I just want to talk about that central thesis, which was basically that she's had a look at the books and things are a lot worse than they seemed. Is that really true, or is this just political framing?
Well, you've got to wind back a bit. All the way through the election campaign, Labour ran a safety first, basically, approach to this election. And key to that was basically trying to reassure people that Labour was not about to get into power and tax people heavily, or indeed borrow a great deal of money. So throughout that campaign, Rachel Reeves set incredibly tough rules on borrowing, basically copying and pasting the Tories' fiscal rules. But in order to do that, effectively, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer needed to do a bit of hear no evil, see no evil. And even though the Institute for Fiscal Studies, we at Sky, commentators all over the place were going, hang on a moment, we know that there are lots of pressures on the public finances, and we know, because previous governments have done it, that you're very likely to come in, have a look at the books, throw your hands in the air and go, oh my God, this is so much worse. And that will give you permission in order to do tough stuff you didn't signal in advance. We did have a sense that something like this was coming. And whilst Rachel Reeves can, with some justification, say there are things they had no idea that were problems when they got in, nevertheless, because Labour run such a cautious, such a conservative, as it were, election playbook, there was probably always going to be a moment like this.
So basically there were a few surprises, but a lot of these pressures that she's talking about, they already knew were coming. In terms of the political framing, is this clever politics? Because does this set the scene for her to be able to do things that maybe they didn't talk about in the general election campaign, to raise taxes, to cut back on lots of different areas of public spending? Is this kind of her George Osborne, there's no money left moment that gives her a lot more leeway over the next 6 months to a year?
So Rachel Reeves has been able to do a whole load of things, difficult decisions, and they'd be difficult for any government, that simply were not in the Labour manifesto. Yet here they are today making big choices. She's never going to be more powerful than she is right now.
This is the moment to make these decisions, right?
This is the trickiest bit. And those are the decisions that she's decided to take using, as it were, the political capital that's been built up by the election campaign and by the warnings that she's been able to issue about the state of the finances off the back of the work that this government's done in the first 3.5 weeks. I think the question comes down to whether or not Rachel Reeves is able to preserve her reputation as a fair dealer. I think that's what she would want to be seen as, whether she is dealing with the black hole in a reasonable way, she's explaining it and then trying to close it in a reasonable way, or whether she's making political choices. I think there's a bigger picture question, though, for Rachel Reeves, which is today has been a moment where she's had to announce pain. The budget on October the 31st will be another moment where she has to announce more pain. And that's when you will get, for instance, the tax rises. We didn't get any tax rises today.
So is that the feeling that you got from today, that tax rises are coming?
So if you look at the numbers, they're very stark. Rachel Reeves found a black hole of about £22 billion, and she found about £5 to £6 billion in savings of current spending in this year in order to offset that 22 billion. But that still leaves a shortfall of 17 billion pounds. That's what she's got to find. Those are the sums. She'll have to do it in the budget. I think there are two ways: tax rises and welfare cuts, and potentially squeezes on spending yet further. But she has already asked for efficiencies in Whitehall departments. Those are already budgeted for in the 5 or so that they said they're going to save this year. So welfare cuts and tax risings feel like they're going to have to do quite a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to October the 31st. And that's just for this year. So the pain isn't over. They talk about a 3-phase parliament, of which fixing the foundations is the first phase before they can start repairing Britain, would be their way of describing it, in order to make all the parts of the country better off. Those are the next 2 steps of the journey as they see it, all the time trying to pin the blame for the scale of the cutbacks and the tax rises on the previous government, while they remain popular and the previous government still remains divided and in the doldrums.
Just watching it, it seemed like such a honeymoon period moment, because there's always a time period for a government that's coming in where they get to make these big announcements and they don't have any of the responsibility for what's going on, and at the same time the opposition are in real disarray. And even if you looked at the opposition benches, they looked really defeated and miserable. And is that the sort of atmosphere, do you think?
At the moment, the Conservatives are concentrating on one thing, which is the leadership election, the result of which is announced from memory the week after the budget. And in 2010, George Osborne and the Conservatives in coalition did a very good job making Labour seem even more toxic. They were in the middle of a leadership contest and pinning the blame for bad public finances on that government then. And that stain really helped the Tories win 5 years later in the 2015 general election. That is exactly what Labour are trying to do to the Tories at the moment.
How's Rachel Reeves doing? And how is Labour doing in government in the first few weeks? Are they landing their messages? Are they looking unified compared to previous administrations? Marks out of 10.
Labour has come in with a series of primary colours, pretty straightforward announcements that really matched what they promised they would do in opposition. The stories that you hear from kind of behind the scenes in Whitehall are of people really trying to work out what way is up. I think there is a bit less certainty about exactly who's in charge of what and what the priorities are and who's calling the shots, be that in Number 10 or elsewhere. But at the moment, we're just trying to work out whether or not that's absolutely par for the course, teething problems of any new government. And there always are when a new government comes in. The bottom line is that Keir Starmer will never have very many excuses, because he's got a stonking majority. He has a moment where he's got a team that he knows around the top table who know their brief and are on top of what they need. And so I think they'll be pretty happy with what they have so far.
That's all for today. You can read more analysis from our politics team here in Westminster on the Sky News website. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.